Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 307 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm delighted to catch up with Amy Peters, who has a Level 4 Diploma in Therapeutic Counselling, a Level 6 Child Counselling Certificate. She's a trained rewind therapist, accredited member of the National Counselling and Psychotherapeutic Society, and she also runs a busy practice counselling neurodivergent teens and adults. Today, Amy is going to talk about a lecture she has delivered for the Counsellor CPD Library on the topic of neurodivergent-affirming practice. So with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Delighted to welcome you to episode 307 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory and myself, Ken, are glad you joined us for 3 stops on today's journey, starting off with that ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about how we grow and evolve as a counselling practitioner across the arc of our practice. We then delve into Practice Matters, where an interview was held with Amy Peters, and the lecture was on neurodivergent-affirming practice. And there's a lecture about that in our library, but Rory will be telling you more, and he beautifully introduced that at the top of today's program. You don't want to miss it. And of course, in Student Services, our last section today, we're reflecting on Counselling Training Journey. As many students come to the end of at least part of their journey, how do we reflect back? Can that serve us? What does looking back enable us to do when we move forward? So that's our episode, and kicking us off with that ethical, sustainable practice, Rory, growing and evolving as a counselling practitioner. And I guess when I read that topic, I recognized that when I graduated and first went into placement as a counsellor, my practice was very different to when I was a mature counsellor and had a few years under my belt. And what was interesting is I was seeing different kind of outcomes and different kinds of relationships with clients.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And it took me back a little bit to me, graduating all that time ago as a freshly minted therapist, going out into the world. And I'm a lot different now than I was then. And this conversation actually was generated from a conversation on our Facebook page. Quite an interesting conversation. And if you don't know what our Facebook is, if you go to Facebook, just type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. Come on in and you'll see lots of interesting conversations. But this one caught my eye because someone posted and said, how do we know if we're becoming more effective, if we're developing and growing as a therapist? And it was an interesting debate. And some people thought that, well, we don't want to go down the route of being measured and targets and that type of thing, because it can be quite difficult because you're working with an amount of unpredictability. You're helping clients make sense of their own lives. And sometimes clients will only go so far, or sometimes they won't return, or sometimes they'll have major breakthroughs and move their lives on. So it was quite a polarized conversation, but very interesting nonetheless. And I think that I was thinking about this, I'm in a very fortunate position because I speak on a regular basis, as we'll hear today when you hear me speaking to Amy Peters. I speak to a lot of therapists who are really, really invested in their practices. I've got a very dear friend who is a child therapist, works in children's homes. Her practice is completely different from when she graduated, when I was her tutor all those years ago. And now she's a real expert in her field. In other words, when it comes to child therapy and working within children's homes, she really is top of her field. And the reason for that is two things. Eminent curiosity. She's a completely curious person, which is a thread that really does run through those people who really care about the practices. They're really curious. What's next? Where are we going next? What can I find out? What don't I know? And also, she's still very passionate about the work. And if you ask her, if I say to her, you're top of your field, she'll just poo-poo that off. She'll just dismiss it. Oh, no, I'm not. Quite humble. So I think it's really important that, if we're in this for the long haul, the curiosity, passion, and really listening, if we do client outcome questionnaires, if you work for an organisation, we really listen to them. It's no good looking at a client's outcome questionnaire and saying, oh, well, client's completely wrong there. What was this client thinking when they left this negative feedback? If someone gives you some feedback, then you need to think about it and develop it. And ours is a profession that is built, Ken, on reflection, being reflective, and also being reflexive, doing something about what we reflected on. And we do that in a number of ways. And one of the ways we do that, and one of the ways we grow as a therapist, is continual professional development.
It is, and when you're speaking about niching down there and becoming an expert in your field, it usually starts with doing continuing professional development, maybe doing a mini lecture or listening to a certain topic and going, wow, that really resonates with me, and then maybe delving deeper and doing a course and specializing in that area. But I find this a really interesting topic, and I'm going to say why, Rory. Here at Counselling Tutor, we have a pretty large team that creates resources and does academic checks and basically serves and delivers courses. We've got a number of tutors that work with us as well. And we have an HR professional. We have a person who looks after the well-being of the people that work within Counselling Tutor. And part of that process from that HR professional is to hold one-to-one meetings with each individual within the organization and to kind of measure or look at how they are doing. And as counsellors, we kind of maybe think that we are removed from that. And the discussion you kind of led with, Rory, coming in at the top, saying, maybe as counsellors we shouldn't be targeted or measured. Then how do we know that there is some kind of progression? And if you look at most companies or most positions in companies, there's some form of measurement of how you're doing, and that kind of how you're doing would relate in perhaps getting an increase or being moved into a management position based on how you were doing. But it's tricky for us because we can hardly say to each client as they're leaving, how are we doing? Well, we can in a way. We can have an exit questionnaire. And like you said, Rory, we can look at that feedback and we can understand that and look where we can learn and where we can grow. But of course, we have our supervisor. And our supervisor, in a way, watches over us and looks how we're doing. A good supervisor should be interested in how you are progressing within your overall counselling career, the direction you're going in, know what your interest is, what your goals are in your counselling career, as well as of course, as looking at your individual client presentations. But that is one way maybe of sharing where your journey with a peer and getting feedback from a professional that is further down the line on how you were doing. But of course, there's no better feedback than that comes from our clients. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we need a client feedback from every client to understand that there is progression. So, I checked in, Rory, saying that, when I first graduated, the work I was doing with clients felt very different to how it felt maybe 5 years after really maturing as a therapist. And you may see that there is more notable improvement in a clients' well-being from the sessions that you are having, that clients are more repeating that they're having breakthroughs, or that this is really resonating with them, or this is really working for them. And maybe, and this is not always the case, so this is a tricky one, maybe looking at your client retention can be an indicator. So if you're seeing many clients and they're coming in and you're kind of having an initial session and saying, let's see how we go over a 6-session period and then we can review, and at session 3 most of them are dropping out, might be an indication of something in practice. So that, and it may not be, because it is a client's choice, of course, to leave anytime they wish to. They're not contracted in for that period of time. But client retention can be an indicator, and it certainly was noticeable in my own practice, Rory. When I was in practice, certainly the more mature I was, I found that that my clients were less likely to just suddenly disappear or not continue with their therapeutic journey. And of course, that is an indicator for us. But another massive indicator, Rory, and I think this is an important topic that we can discuss, is that self-reflection and self-awareness of as a therapist, and the ability to look at your practice and go, right, I'm growing here. And I wonder if you can kind of speak us through that increased self-awareness. And you've already mentioned reflexive and reflective practice, and of course emotional regulation we may find also develops as we kind of grow. That all falls under that topic of self-awareness, Rory.
Yes, and I think this isn't about always knowledge. We've spoke together, Ken, a lot recently on the podcast about skill-based learning and not knowledge-based learning. And knowledge is great. Having knowledge of things is fantastic, but actually having the skills to apply that knowledge. And I think that, part of an internal reflection, and certainly I did this with my supervisor, excuse me, through the years, where I've talked about how I've developed myself within the therapeutic relationship, how I've been able to speak more freely, how I've been able to integrate myself with the client, to develop deeper relational depth, to feel more vulnerable, as a therapist, because sometimes when you're talking and working with clients, you can feel quite vulnerable, thinking, should I say this? Should I say that? And I think that's been one of the biggest areas of growth. Yes, I've done a lot of knowledge-based training over the years, but certainly applying the knowledge through communication and through skill is quite a craft. And that's one of the things I think that therapists should think about. How are you applying that knowledge? How are you, you say, for instance, it's trauma, and you think you've got a client who's traumatized. How do you communicate that? Knowing what the presentation is with the knowledge, but actually working with the client are two very different things. And as a supervisor, I spend a lot of my time with my supervisees saying, so so you've got this knowledge, but how did you use that knowledge? What happened? How did you apply it? What was the result of it? And I think that's where our work and our profession lies. It lies in the ability to meet the clients where they're at and to empathically impart or support them with knowledge and the communication of that. And that sometimes means that you've got to look at the way you communicate, or I communicate, and how I work with that client. And I think that's quite a big challenge. Doing a course is one thing, applying it is something completely different.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we've spoken about this on so many occasions, how within counselling psychotherapy, it's not just the book learning. If you're a scientific researcher, you just need book learning and the ability to kind of deep dive and pay attention, and you can read more books and become more efficient at that. Within counselling and psychotherapy, we are a massive part of the interaction with our clients. It's not just the book learning. Yes, it's important to do the CPD and the continuing professional development, but our own self-awareness and how we show up is so important, which it may not be in many other professions. And there's a saying that a client can only go as far as the counsellor can go. And maybe one way of kind of judging your overall growth and your evolution within your counseling practice is looking at, are you able to now take clients further? Are you able to go into areas when a client brings something that may have been unknown to you before? And of course, we unlock those additional areas. Number one, by looking at self and looking at things that might come up for us. It might be transferential, or we might have traumatic responses linked to certain topics or actions where it's difficult for us to go there. So that works on personal development, but it also can be presentation related. So if a client comes in and speaks about a presentation or where they find themselves and we don't know anything about that, then we can't go too deep into that. Yes, we can empathically hold that person and be there with their feelings and emotions in the present moment, but without a full understanding of what they're bringing, we kind of, it could potentially make the interaction shallower. And that's where we're called for that continuing professional education. And we often find that our clients teach us. So our clients teach us in how we kind of see how a client reacts and works within our sessions. But also clients can teach us by maybe with a presentation that sends us away to do some CPD within that area. And I think this keys into what you have on this super duper handout, which we'll cover in a moment, Rory, which is the adaptability. You know, when we graduate, we come out, we're kind of in the box of the modality that we have been chosen to do. Usually within university or your learning institution, there's going to be firm boundaries to stay within your modality, specifically for your assignments and your observed skill sessions. So you graduate with those invisible walls around you that are holding you in there, and recognizing that adaptability, re-examining those walls, those kind of invisible barriers that we build during our training is a requirement as we progress and as we grow. And then there was another area, Rory, that I think is a massive indicator that you are growing and evolving as a practitioner. And it does key into what we've spoken about before. If you're undertaking personal development and you're undertaking continuing professional development, maybe doing courses, maybe attending conferences on topics that match you and your practice, then what's going to happen is you may find that you start developing a professional network, and that your professional network grows as you grow. More people that you can turn to have peer-to-peer discussions, more people that you might refer to that might refer into you. And I think that is an indicator, Rory, of that maturity in practice, when you look around you and you're surrounded by like-minded people on the same journey, some further ahead, some at your level, where you can share kind of the passion of helping and caring for others.
Yeah, hallelujah, Ken. That's what I say. Hallelujah. Honestly, I'm punching the air. If anybody can see me behind the studio screen here, it's absolutely true. And you know, counselling is it's a craft-based endeavour. And when I say craft, it's not unlike someone who's a fine furniture maker, or someone who's a gilder who gilds mirrors with gold leaf. It's a craft, and that craft is generated by knowledge, but it's actually the care and attention that's put into the work that makes the difference. And if you have a professional network of people, you tend to find that you get a more nuanced idea of the craft. So I'll give you an example of that. I'm building at this time a course for practitioners to work more effectively with people who are neurodivergent. And I have working with a colleague who is very knowledgeable in this field. And I have a number of meetings talking about, you know, what I'm going to put into the course, you know, what the course content's going to look like. And she said, and in the meeting we had this week, it was nuanced. It was very, very nuanced, you know, turning the phrase of words around so they meant more, or asking me to think about how I can ask practitioners to do certain reflective exercises so that they're more in tune with someone who's neurodivergent. And I'd done all the research. I'd done a huge amount of research, because that's kind of what I do. But actually, when I spoke to someone who was really at the pointy end of this work, she really made the research pop. In other words, yes, I completely get it now. It's like going back to school again. And that was to do with the fact that I was happy to have a peer assessment of my work. And she did actually say to me, how do you feel about feedback? And I said, oh, it's great. As I said, feedback's the breakfast of champions, right? And she gave me this feedback, and it was just like pure gold. I know that if I work with a neurodivergent person, or within this course I'm providing, I'm going to have a different aspect, and that is to do with having feedback given and accepting the feedback and working with people on that trail. There's an old adage, certainly when I started many years ago, about craft in counselling, and it's the apprentice-based endeavour. You start as an apprentice, really, in a agency. You work for free, and then what happens is you develop, and it's apprenticed, journey person, master craft. And it's that journey from being an apprentice to being a master craftsperson that is always taken with knowledge, with supervision, with a meeting with peers and discussing, and also having those tough conversations with yourself, Ken.
Yes, I really love the example you used there of turning to a peer that you see as having a special interest and a lot of training within that area to kind of check out what it is that you're doing, even though you are kind of going to the academic papers and textbooks. You're looking for that real world application. And it made me reflect back to early days. So often when we graduate and we're just going out into counselling, one of the things we're saying is, I have to get this right. I know that was a big one for me. I've got to get this right. I have to get it right. And it's interesting with maturity within your practice, it's no longer the I, it is the we. We are stronger together. The bigger your network or the more quality your network, the more you can key in. And it's no longer I need to know everything and do everything. It's what do you think of this? And having those professional discussions and the doors open to those. So much to discuss here. And there's some takeaways. I'm going to try and cover links for things we've covered just discussing this topic. The first link you're going to love because it's the super duper free handout that Rory has made. Now, this super duper free handout is called Growing and Evolving as a Counselling Practitioner. It covers client outcomes, self-reflection and awareness, professional development, skills and techniques, professional relationships, personal growth, and outcome measurement. And that is all beautifully put together into a PDF that you can download, store, and revisit anytime you like. And you can get that handout by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is our mother website. Click on the podcast tab and click on episode 307. That's the one you're looking for, 307. The show notes are there with any links we discuss. Plus, you can download that handout for free. Just take it. Have it. It's really worth having it. What we also discussed is the importance of continuing professional development. I'm going to mention that we have a CPD library. You hear Rory in the podcast reaching out and speaking to top professionals. Well, they make lectures for us and we put them into the library. So if you're looking for maybe the area that you want to specialize in, speak to someone who's speaking about equine therapy or walk and talk therapy. Neurodivergent-Affirming practice, which is spoken about in today's episode by Amy Peters. So, and there's a wealth of information in there. Rory also spoke about the importance of supervision. Our supervision training course is cohort based, so you do that with a group of peers, which builds community. Our trauma-informed practice course also is cohort based. You do it with a community, and that's where you can build those professional networks. And if you're interested in any of the training that Counselling Tutor offers, just go to counsellingtutor.com and it's all there on the home page. So that is our ethical, sustainable practice. Go and get that free super duper handout. And as we back out of sustainable practice, it's into practice matters, and that chat that you had with Amy Peters, who did a lecture on neurodivergent-affirming practice, Rory, and of course that is in our CPD library. So if you are a member, log in and go and check that out. But Rory, tell us a little bit of what we can expect from this.
Well, with a link to what we're talking about master practitioners, I don't think they become any more masterful than Amy Peters, who is a neurodivergent person herself, and she runs a neurodivergent affirming practice. She did a lecture for that CPD library on neurodivergent-affirming practice. And I caught up with her to ask her about the lecture, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Neurodiversity is a growing edge within counselling and psychotherapy. We're seeing more and more neurodivergent clients, and it's just so important to meet them where they're at. So I'm delighted to be speaking with Amy Peters, who's done a fantastic lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library on neurodivergent-affirming practice. So, Amy Peters, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Rory. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, as part of your model, or as part of the lecture you gave, you talked about the diverse model of neurodivergent affirming practice. And it's actually called DIVERSE, but it's an acronym. And if we work through that acronym, which means that effectively each letter has a specific meaning, we can work through that. And maybe we could get a sense of how that links to neurodivergent affirming practice. So the word is diverse, and it starts off by diversify perspectives, exploring life experience through a neurodivergent lens. So what does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think when I'm thinking of neurodivergent affirming therapy, I'm thinking of the client that's going to come into the therapy room with me. Quite possibly, they might be late diagnosed, they might be late identifying as neurodivergent. That's very, very common, and we're seeing more and more of that in the therapy room now. And actually, what often happens for people is that we may have had these experiences in our life that we've seen one particular way, through one particular lens. And then when we realize we're neurodivergent, like myself, we're then looking back on all those life experiences and having to kind of reshuffle everything, having to look at it a completely different way. And it gives a completely new meaning on it when we know more about our neurodivergent traits, for example. So I think as the counsellor, what we can do is gain a really strong knowledge of neurodivergent traits and how people experience the world as a neurodivergent person, which can really help us to then work with the client to have a look through and kind of sift through those experiences and work out what that means for them.
Absolutely. And someone who, like yourself, who's had an assessment late on in life, you're absolutely correct, because I've recently had a late assessment, and it's meant that I had to go through my entire life and think, well, that's probably why I didn't do well at school, or that's probably why I had difficulty establishing relationships when I was younger, or that's why this happened, or that's why I fell out with that person. And it was quite an interesting journey, but also it kind of brought up a lot of emotional power, because I'd realised that the missing part of me wasn't known to me, and it wasn't known to others, and as a consequence of that, it impacted on communication and the outcomes of relationships. I guess it's something that a lot of neurodivergent people explore in therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would echo that too. And I think there's also a lot of shame that we end up holding on to around things, because we've effectively felt like maybe we're broken in some way, or we're disordered in some way, but maybe not known why and what's going on. Whereas actually the neurodivergent affirming therapy approach takes this approach that's not like the medical model, which teaches us that there is something wrong, there is something disordered. It's actually looking at this as just a difference. But of course, with looking at all of those differences, there's just so much to uncover.
There is.
We've got so many unknowns, as you say.
Yes, it's like the Johari window all over again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the I in diverse stands for intersectionality, and those who've listened to the podcast will know that's the work of the American sociologist Kimberly Crenshaw. But in terms of neurodiversity, what does intersectionality mean?
So I talk about intersectionality within this, within neurodivergent-affirming practice, as the idea that neurodivergence doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I'm not just a neurodivergent person. I'm also a white person. I'm also a woman. I'm also ADHD. I'm a parent. And there are all these intersectionalities where my identities intersect. And so it's so vitally important that we look at our clients' intersectionalities. So how do their identities intersect? How does that influence the way that their life has gone? How does that influence their beliefs and their values? And then also for us to look as the counsellor ourselves, to look at our own identities and how our identities intersect and interact with that of our clients at the same time.
Yes, and I think that's really, really interesting, because when we think of intersectionality, it's sometimes framed in oppression. In other words, how our identities have somehow been oppressed. And I guess that, as a white man, I could point to the fact I'm of working class roots, and there could be a slight amount of repression there. Certainly when I was a younger person, working class voices weren't particularly well heard. But I like what you're saying about the idea that we have to not only understand the impact on clients, but also where we are in terms of our many different personas in terms of intersectionality. I'm a man, you're a woman. A few weeks ago, I interviewed a number of black therapists. They would have had an intersectional view of the world, which was different to my frame of reference.
Absolutely. And that difference really comes out when we're looking through this neurodivergent lens again, because we can see that everyone will have had those unique experiences depending on how their identities intersect.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, the V is value neurodivergent voices. Listen to and learn from neurodivergent people. I like this because I think therapists should always learn from the clients. What may we learn by paying close attention to neurodivergent voices?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think really what we're doing with this is learning from the people who we're talking about at the end of the day, or who we're talking to. And I think when I talk about valuing neurodivergent voices, I'm also talking about, like, within training, for example, if we're learning about neurodivergence, we need to be learning from neurodivergent people. If we're reading books about neurodivergence, they need to be written by neurodivergent people, because actually they're the people that have that life experience. And of course, as we were saying, that's going to be very different for different people, depending on their identities and so on. But actually, it's raising up those voices and giving a platform, I think, to a group that has traditionally and historically been silenced and shamed for their way of being.
Absolutely. And I think for me, listen and learn from neurodivergent people is that one of the things that I've become to understand is that once you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. We're all different. We're a great rainbow of difference, and I guess the thing for me is, and I guess something to take away really, is not to stereotype. Everybody's different. They're different as anybody else. Now, the E in diverse is embrace neurodivergent characteristics, and you say focus on how to integrate them, not eradicate them, and you say reject ABA. So am I reading this as to say that it's about helping clients embrace their neurodiversity and not try to have an internalized critic about them?
Yes, absolutely. It's about normalizing those different traits and those different characteristics, and really helping the client to thrive, to become their own authentic self. Whereas I think traditionally, going back years in terms of therapy, for example, I think there would have been a much of a move towards trying to help clients to become more neurotypical, to behave in a certain way that was more palatable, for example, or that was seen as the typical way to behave. Whereas actually what we're trying to do, we're not trying to get rid of those traits for that client. We're sitting with them when they explore these traits, but actually we're also looking at how can they bring that together? How can they learn acceptance, self-compassion, and reducing some of that kind of self-blame that we've ended up holding on to, I think. And the idea of rejecting ABA. So ABA is applied behavior analysis, which is a type of therapy that is quite common within the US, but also I think there are variations over here in the UK. And that tends to seek to make usually children who are neurodivergent to become more neurotypical. It's really about conforming, and it can be really damaging and really traumatic for people. So very much being neurodivergent affirming is about rejecting that kind of therapy and focusing on integrating these traits with clients. Yes.
And I think that, we hear a lot about masking in the neurodivergent world, where people, for want of a better word, pretend to be neurotypical to fit in, because they feel that maybe they won't be accepted for who they are, their real self, and that kind of speaks to the kind of spirit of therapy, doesn't it? Because if someone's neurodivergent or not, we're trying to help them find their authentic self, their congruent self, as we'd say in the person-centered world.
Yes, absolutely. And again, thinking of the late diagnosed or late identified neurodivergent person, we may not have even known we were masking.
Yes.
We may not have even known to the degree that we were masking as well. So actually, therapy can be the really safe place for somebody to uncover that and to work out what that actually means to them. And I think it's important to say also that the goal within therapy is not necessarily for the client to completely unmask. That wouldn't necessarily be safe for them in every circumstance. That wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for them in every circumstance. But it is actually for them to build the self-awareness of what's going on for them, I guess.
Yeah, and to have the choice to be able to maybe say, well, I'm going to be my authentic self or mask. Because I guess we all, even people who are not neurodivergent, sometimes mask. I mean, I know people who've been to some pretty boring parties who smiled and nodded and said, "Oh, this is the most wonderful thing ever." Where inside they were looking at the watch, hoping that they could exit quickly. So sometimes it comes to this false and true self, which is sometimes taught in child therapy, isn't it? It's embracing. Sometimes one has to put on a face. I've sat in a few meetings when I was a teacher thinking, I wish I could get out of here. So it does happen, but it's giving the choice. I think that's really important. Now, the R is recognise ableism, and it says recognise and challenge ableism, including internalised ableism. So just give us a sense of what that term ableism means in this frame.
Yeah, so ableism is really a set of beliefs or maybe practices that discriminate against people with disabilities, and kind of says that typical abilities are superior. Sort of what it's saying, really. And internalised ableism, because ableism is rife really in society, sadly, and within lots of our systems, actually internalised ableism is where we've taken that on board. And of course, we take that on board as the counsellor, as a neurotypical person, but also as a neurodivergent person, as the client. So this here is about working through that. And it really is a process. And I think even for me, over the years, there's still bits and pieces that I'm uncovering all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting. Earlier on today, I recorded another podcast, and I shared with my guest that I don't write very well. So if you give me a pen and a piece of paper, you might get a very good representation of a drunk spider at some point, wandering around the page, but nothing that you could actually read. And for a long time, I struggled with that, thinking that, there's something wrong with me, until I realised that actually I just found a better way of communicating. Hence, I spend my time in front of a microphone a lot. But it took a bit of time to unlearn, because you're told, that writing is essential. Certainly when I went to school, I'm not sure it's the case now, that if you couldn't write, if your penmanship, notice the sexism in that, your penmanship wasn't correct, then somehow you were just less than. And, and that becomes an introjected value within people. So, yeah, I think that's really useful. And then the S is for support and accommodate, e.g. for EF differences, learning styles. So what is EF differences?
So EF is just short for executive functioning differences. Yeah, so supporting, this is about supporting and accommodating within your practice as a counsellor. So that might be looking at your procedures, your processes, your forms, how accessible is your referral process, all of those things. Starting to look at how you can support all your clients, neurodivergent or not. And then also looking at within sessions, so how accessible are your sessions? Can you offer movement breaks? Can you offer captions if you're using Zoom, for example, or another online platform? Can you provide fidget toys for your clients? Can you be flexible in your actual approach to counselling and change depending on the client that you're with? And really accommodating, like I say, those different learning styles as well. So do you have visual learners in the room? Do you have different ways of explaining certain things to your clients? So yeah, it's really looking in a holistic way at all your practices as a counsellor.
Yes, and it speaks to reasonable adjustments, doesn't it? The Equality Act, certainly here in the UK, talks about making reasonable adjustments. So, looking over your policies, your procedures, how you meet, even small things, which is that some neurodivergent people don't like using the phone. There's a lot of research to say they prefer either visual, face-to-face, maybe on Zoom, and just building that into your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's offering different things and also collaborating with the client, asking the question, what are their needs? And obviously sometimes the client isn't going to know that. So it might be actually offering different things to them. But yes, making it flexible, making adjustments wherever you can to make it accessible, I think. Yeah,
and those accommodations may emerge within the therapy session or the arc of therapy. So it might be that someone, for instance, wants a 30-minute session one day. They can only do 30 minutes. And trying to unlearn the kind of, the kind of frameworks that we taught as therapists. We have 50-minute sessions. We have them once a week, to try to unlearn them. And then finally, the E is empathy towards different. Identify internal biases and adapt language, difference over deficit. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking that's a question that we need to ask ourselves as therapists first and foremost.
Yes, absolutely. And the identifying internal biases is sort of what we've already spoken about. It's really getting to know those blind spots, like the Johari window we were talking about earlier. But I think in terms of language, because language, we can get very hung up on language sometimes, but actually it does really bring clarity to people. And the language we use around neurodiversity and neurodivergent affirming language is very much non-pathologizing. So that is moving away from the medical model idea of the disorders, the deficits, whereas we're just looking at this as these are differences. And actually that's taking all the shame away from it, I think, because it's such a big thing to feel that maybe you're faulty in some ways, your brain is faulty, you've got missing parts of you, or you're a broken neurotypical. Whereas actually what we're doing here is really kind of creating that empathy and giving that empathy to our clients by using that sort of language that's non-pathologizing.
Yes, I think that's really important, isn't it? Because a lot of people, may start off by saying, well, I struggle. I've heard the term mentally ill. Some people have said I'm mentally ill, or I'm not all there. and not to fall into that trap of kind of collaborating with that thinking and saying it's different, just like someone may be tall or not tall, maybe big build or not big build. Neurodivergence or neurodiversity is the diverse way that people think and communicate. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's different.
Absolutely. And I think we're also not dismissing the struggles here. We're not dismissing the challenges, but what we're doing is maybe looking at the wider context around why those challenges can be there. And actually, a lot of times those challenges are societal factors that have kind of created barriers for people who are neurodivergent.
Absolutely. So finally, as we come to the end of this interview, what do you hope that those who watch your lecture will take away from it?
I think this model, really, I designed it to create a bit of a framework so that counsellors and therapists can actually start to really audit their practices in a way and think about how they're working with their neurodivergent clients. So I just really, really hope actually from this, they can take this framework and think, okay, what's the next step? What's the next part of my growth as a professional? Where do I need to go? What type of CPD do I need to do next? And I think actually if this can just be a stepping stone to that growth and that more learning for those counsellors, I think.
Fantastic. And of course, we've only touched on a small snippet of your lecture. So Amy Peters' lecture, Neurodivergent-Affirming Practice, is available in the Counsellor CPD library. So all it remains for me to say is, Amy Peters, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to our guest, Amy Peters, and to you, Rory, for holding the important discussions and bringing us the continuing professional development. And we now move into student services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your Counselling Tutor discount. That's counsellingskillsacademy.com. Today in Student Services, reflecting on your counselling training journey. Now, there's those that say we shouldn't look back, Rory. We should just look forward and use the momentum of what was behind us to go forward. But there are times when reflecting is really important, specifically in personal development, professional growth as a counsellor.
Yes, well, as we come to the end of the academic year, this podcast is recorded in late June of 2024, and people will be coming to the end of their studies, and then there'll be a long academic break. And in that academic break, I always think it's useful to reflect on the journey that one has taken, the arc of personal development that happens within a counselling course. And I guess you have your last lesson, you tidy your paperwork up, you leave, and then you're off on your holidays. But actually, you might carry with you massive changes that have happened, relationship changes, or changes in the way you view the world, or you view yourself, or how you've learned to communicate in a different way. And I think that the counselling courses are kind of tough emotionally for people. I've never known anybody who's gone through a counselling course and didn't feel a little wrung out at the end of it, a little fatigued emotionally, because it does challenge you to look at yourself and your view of the world and where you got your view of the world from. So taking some time just to reflect and putting some time aside just to think about how things have changed and what that might mean going forward. I think there's cause and effect. So, sometimes you might find yourself, thinking about a relationship that you've had, and you've realized that maybe that relationship needs either renegotiating or needs terminating. How do you go about that? What are you going to do about it? And also just taking time to grow as a person and to celebrate your achievement. I think anybody who graduates any counselling course should really give themselves a pat on the back, Ken.
Very much so. And throw the hands in the air, and we give full permission to go, woohoo, if you wish to as well. Yeah, very much, Rory. There you go. Word of the day, it seems like. Yeah, this reflecting on your counselling training journey is a really good exercise to do as a student. And the reason I say it's a good exercise is because it is something you're called on to do for the rest of your counselling career. You might reflect on how a client session went and what you can learn from that and how you might implement that. Looking at how it was, you might reflect back on your last year in practice. So starting at the end of your training journey and asking yourself questions like, who was I when I started this journey, and who am I now? Am I the same person? And if I'm slightly different, what has actually changed within me? And making that definite, really looking and saying, what is that? A great way of processing this is to journal it, to write it down, because it's just a way of kind of getting it out from just going round in the head. And you can do that via an audio app if you wish to, or you can write it down, or you can say it to a video, whatever matches you and your kind of learning style. But getting it outside of self is really, really, really useful. And these reflections that you kind of put down, like looking back and looking at the change, looking at the development, looking at the growth, can be very useful to future you. You can look back over the years at all of your reflections of the different parts of your journey and see how you've grown. And I mean, we've spoken at the top of this podcast in Ethical Sustainable Practice about growing and evolving as a counselling practitioner. And I think it would be very valuable to look back and go, well, who was I when I did graduate? And who was I when I started my studies, and who was I when I graduated, and then looking and reflecting back. And part of the reflecting, we can look at the growth and we can celebrate that growth, but we can also look at the places where we found challenge. We can look back and go, I felt, and I'm just using an example that I'm making up here, it's from my own journey, I felt extreme anxiety around assignments. And maybe we can think about, if we encounter such things again, how we might work differently. And that is taking reflection and building it into how we might act differently in the future, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of an evaluation and a bit of a spring clean, if you like, of your emotional structure, and to have a think about who you are now. Almost certainly the person you were when you walked through the door in your class won't be the person you are now. That's just the nature of the journey of counselling training. And also think just to be a little bit mindful that, you may have a partner or friends or relatives. They've not been through the same journey as you. They've not been in that same situation. So you may come out of it and find that, I don't know, some of your relationships, are questioned and that their values don't match. But I think part of making any decision about, how you proceed with relationships is to understand that, you've gone through quite a unique experience. Counselling training for me was an incredibly unique experience. And when I came out of it, I certainly wasn't the same person I went in. I was a very, very different person. My worldview had changed. And also I had a real understanding of how people ticked, if you like, how people operated, because I've been taught psychological theories. So it was a case of making, I guess kind of being thoughtful and thinking, well, not everybody's had this opportunity, and maybe I should be a little bit forgiving and a little bit accepting that people just may not see the world as I have. I think it's very easy to become a little bit fundamental when you've catapulted out of counselling training. Like you've got this this new knowledge and you want to be evangelistic about it. And I think sometimes it's best to use a bit of wisdom and just allow people to be. But take that time to reflect, maybe go for a walk or go somewhere on your own and just ask that question, who am I now? Who am I now? Who am I now? And what will the future hold? It's the incredible, I speak for myself, but it was the incredible affirming journey, which changed everything for me. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who's gone through a counselling course who feels like that.
Yeah, and I love the word you used. Who am I now? Who am I now? And that reflection on the journey. And I hope I'm not giving away any super secrets here, Rory, but you've certainly shared with me personally that as you finished your studies, you went for a very long walk and sat on a big rock on a very large hill.
Yes, I did. My level my certificate was probably the biggest growth spurt, and I had the Monday off, and I went, strangely enough, just down the road from where I now live, and sat on a rock. It's Duffstone's Reservoir for anybody who's interested, and I sat on the rock and I just stared into space for what felt like hours. I suspect it wasn't hours, but just to kind of get a sense of, whoa, what's happened? What's going on here? And I don't think it was any mistake that I sat on a rock. I needed to ground myself. You know, at the end of the podcast, we always say, stay grounded. Well, that's generated from the fact that I sat on the rock. I got a very cold bottom, I seem to remember. However, it was freezing. However, I seem to remember just letting it rush over me, letting the whole of the course just rush over me and kind of engage with every feeling as it came up. And it was mighty beneficial. And we still go walking there now and sit on. I kind of walk past the rock and give it a pat. My wife says, why are you patting rocks? It's like, oh, nothing. It's just a nice rock. I just give it a pat. And, you know, as you do, my wife goes, okay, then, you know, weird. And it kind of, yeah, as I say that, just that time in that space, just to get a sense of what the hell had happened to me and where I was going next, where next on the journey, which kind of links back to the start of the podcast where we talked about growing and evolving. It's really about where's next? What next? Where am I going to go next? What's the curiosity? What am I interested in? And for the first time in my life, in terms of work, I was incredibly empowered and enthused. So yeah, rocks, Ken. What can I tell you?
Wow. And indeed, where next? As we come maybe to the end of this season of the Counselling Tutor podcast, where next? Where next for Counselling Tutor in this podcast? But most importantly, where next for you, our valued listeners? This has been episode 307 of the Counselling Tutor podcast.
Yes, we started off with ethical and sustainable practice, growing and evolving as a counselling practitioner, a discussion about how we may assess our growth and our journey as a counselling practitioner. In Practice Matters, we spoke to Amy Peters, who gave a fantastic lecture for the Counselling Tutor CPD Library on Neurodivergent-Affirming Practice. And finally, in Student Services, as we all come to the end of the academic year, we asked about reflection. We looked at reflecting and looking at the journey so far and taking stock. As always, we thank you for your ears. Ken and myself really value that you are that you've invited us to be part of your journey. So if you have enjoyed this broadcast, why not pop a review onto your favourite podcast platform, iTunes or whichever podcast platform you use. We thank those people who've already very kindly given us a review. And also, if you feel that our conversation may help a peer or a colleague, why not share it on social media or put the link into an email and they can listen too. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.